In a quiet southern town, a widowed black mechanic is raising his daughter alone, dreaming of sending her to a top science school, but struggling to afford the tuition. One dusty afternoon, he comes across a woman struggling beside her broken-down electric car. Without hesitation, he steps in to help and ends up improving the vehicle beyond its original design. What he doesn't know is that she's the CEO of the nation's leading electric car company, and his quiet brilliance is about to open a new door for both him and his daughter. Well past the humming grid of city lights and into the wide-breathing openness of rural land, where the breeze carried more silence than sound and the fields turned golden each sunset like a silent choir of blessings, there stood a modest auto repair shop made of aged wood and careful hands. It wasn't much to look at for those passing by. A slanted roof with rust stains from too many seasons, and a creaky sign that read Carter's Repair, swaying gently in the wind. But for Thomas Carter and his daughter Elisa, it was the quiet heart of their new life. Thomas, a tall, soft-spoken man in his late 40s, with hands hardened by years of work and eyes still carrying the tired warmth of a man who had lost much but refused to give up, had come to this town 3 years earlier, after his wife Monica passed away from cancer. That grief had folded him in half, not with noise or anger, but with a kind of hush, one that made the buzzing city unbearable and led him to this still place where memories could be laid to rest without being forgotten. Each morning, before the roosters crowed or the sun painted the fields, Thomas rose quietly and made coffee in a tin pot, always leaving a second mug ready for Elisa, even if she didn't drink it right away. Elisa, now 18 and already too mature for her years, had the same spark in her gaze that her mother once did, the kind that refused to be dimmed even by sorrow or hardship. She was slender and sharp-minded, more at home with circuit boards and diagrams than with dresses or dances, and Thomas couldn't help but marvel at her resilience, though he never said it aloud. He didn't need to. She saw it in the way he saved every screw, every wire, every discarded machine part, stacking them in labeled boxes for her weekend experiments, like sacred offerings to a dream too precious to name outright. That dream had come knocking, finally, in the form of a letter, one with bold red insignia and formal typeface that trembled slightly in her hands as she read it aloud to her father. She had been invited to the National Youth Science Competition, one of the most prestigious technical showcases in the country. If she could win, or even place high enough, it would almost guarantee her a spot at the university she had secretly adored for years, a place where minds like hers were not only welcomed, but celebrated. The only barrier was the entry fee, $50. Not much for many, but for the Carters, whose days were counted in how many cars limped into the driveway, $50 was a wall made of concrete. Still, Thomas smiled, that small, unwavering smile of his, and told her not to worry. "We'll get it," he said one evening, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better days. "Might take a few more brake jobs and oil changes, but we'll get it." He said it with the kind of certainty that came not from circumstance but from love, from the kind of quiet faith that fathers held like old tools in their back pocket, ready when needed. In the weeks that followed, Thomas worked longer hours, taking repair calls from neighboring farms, sometimes accepting payment in eggs or flour just to stay afloat. He added an old toolbox to the back of his pickup, converting it into a mobile repair unit. On market days, he drove out early with flyers tucked under his arm, offering low-cost inspections. And when Elisa wasn't buried in her prototypes, she helped him hold the flashlight or clean carburetors, her hands nimble and steady, like she had inherited the pulse of machines from her father's very bones. And through it all there was no complaint. Only the rhythm of effort, the slow choreography of making do and making hope. They didn't speak often of the competition, not because it wasn't important, but because speaking of it made the cost feel heavier. It was easier to smile over dinner, to talk about the neighbor's cat that kept sneaking into the shop, or the way the clouds looked like mountains on some mornings. Love, in their home, was in the silence between two people who understood the stakes without needing to say them. So when Thomas finally saved enough to buy the specialty parts he needed for a few higher-paying repairs, ones that could push them past the $50 mark, he packed his truck one crisp morning and set off toward the town supply store, his heart lighter than it had been in months. He thought perhaps if things went just right, he might even surprise Elisa with the entry fee by the end of the week. Maybe she'd cry. Maybe she'd just hug him like she used to when she was little and thought he could fix anything, and maybe, just maybe, that hug would feel like a promise kept, a circle completed. But out there on the long road back from town, just past the stretch where the trees stood like quiet sentinels, waiting and watching, fate had its own ideas, wrapped not in tragedy, but in something stranger. An unexpected opportunity in the form of a stalled electric vehicle and a stranger with a complicated scowl. And that, though Thomas didn't know it yet, would change everything. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the low hills, casting long amber shadows across the country road as Thomas Carter drove steadily, his old pickup humming beneath him like a worn hymn. The back was weighted with freshly bought tools and gleaming parts wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, items he'd bartered and bargained for all morning, counting out dollars and cents with the kind of quiet care only a father can give when the outcome means more than survival, when it means possibility. The air smelled faintly of hay and distant rain, and Thomas, for the first time in weeks, allowed himself a breath that wasn't bound to worry. It was then, just as he crested a hill near the old Cottonwood Bend, that he saw it. An elegant, almost otherworldly vehicle, pulled awkwardly to the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking like unsure thoughts in the growing dusk. It wasn't a car you expected to see out here, not this far from the city, and certainly not stalled like some common machine. Sleek and silent in design, it was one of those new electric models he'd only read about in magazines left behind at the feed store. Its frame caught the dying light like liquid silver, the kind of car made not just to transport, but to announce. And yet, here it was, idle and vulnerable, hood open like a confession, and standing beside it, pacing with growing frustration, was a woman who looked as if she'd never been this far from concrete in her life. She was in her 30s, maybe a few years younger than Thomas had been when Monica first got sick. Tall, sharp-featured, wearing boots that hadn't seen mud before today, and a tailored jacket too fine for dust. She stood with her hands on her hips, glaring at the open front of the vehicle like it had betrayed her personally. And when she heard the low crunch of gravel under Thomas's tires, she turned with a mix of irritation and what might have been relief, though she didn't offer a wave or a smile. Thomas slowed, instinct already pulling his hand to the gear shift, not because he expected gratitude or reward, but because something about a broken machine, no matter how new, called to him like an old friend in need. He parked a few feet away, stepped out carefully, wiping his hands on the same cloth he always kept tucked in his belt, and offered a polite, measured nod. "Looks like you're having some trouble," he said, voice calm, not too loud, not assuming. "Mind if I take a look?" The woman narrowed her eyes, her voice clipped and cool like the glass of a boardroom window. "It's an Evolve 9 prototype. Full electric, dual-motor sync drive. I designed it, so unless you've got a degree in systems engineering and clearance from my company, I doubt there's anything you can do." Her tone wasn't cruel exactly, just distant, the kind of defense people wear when they're used to being right, or when they're not used to accepting help. Thomas didn't flinch. He simply offered a soft smile, the same one he used when Elisa soldered something backwards but insisted she hadn't. "Sometimes it's not about knowing every circuit on paper," he replied, stepping closer with the ease of someone who'd earned his right to be curious. "Sometimes it's about listening to what the machine's trying to say." She scoffed lightly, but curiosity, or perhaps desperation, held her in place as Thomas leaned over the open compartment, peering inside with eyes trained by decades, not diplomas. What he saw wasn't failure, not exactly, but miscommunication. Fine parts speaking past each other, brilliant design hampered by overlooked details. The drivetrain wasn't syncing fully with the regenerative loop, causing a lag that sent mixed signals to the core processor. A newer mechanic might have missed it. Thomas didn't. He adjusted a connector, tightened a misplaced bolt, and used the tip of his penknife to realign a sensor mount by just a fraction. Then, before he closed the hood, he paused, tilted his head slightly, and examined the deeper structure. The torque relay configuration was wasting potential, throttled by a fuel ratio algorithm that looked brilliant on paper, but underperformed in practice. He knew he could improve it. He could feel it the way a good ear feels an off note in a song, but this wasn't his car, and he wasn't hired to redesign anything. So he did what he could. He quieted the noise. When he stepped back, he nodded toward the driver's seat. "Try her now," he said. The woman hesitated, then climbed in, touched the ignition screen, and watched in visible surprise as the vehicle came to life, not just powered up, but settled, purring quietly like a beast that had finally been understood. The sound that had plagued her team for months, an irregular thrum that caused pitch feedback above 3,000 RPM, was gone, melted into silence. She sat frozen for a moment, hands still on the wheel, then stepped out, her eyes fixed on Thomas, now not with disdain, but with measured wonder. "What did you do?" she asked, more bewildered than demanding. Thomas only shrugged, already folding his rag and heading toward his truck. "Sometimes," he said, over his shoulder, "the answers are in the noise." Then he drove off without asking her name, without offering his, leaving behind nothing but the quiet return of possibility. He didn't look back, but if he had, he might have seen Evelyn Monroe, executive director of Evolve Technologies, standing on the gravel shoulder staring at the fading shape of his truck like she'd just seen something impossible. And maybe, in a way, she had. Because while the world often celebrated loud success, she had just been humbled by a quiet kind of brilliance, one that didn't need a stage to shine. And that kind of brilliance, she realized slowly, wasn't something you stumbled upon twice. By the time Thomas's old truck creaked back into the gravel lot beside Carter's repair, the sky had turned the color of rusted copper, and the cicadas were singing their tired, pulsing tune across the tall grass. He parked beside the shop and unloaded the parts carefully, moving like a man whose thoughts were already back home, where Elisa would be hunched over her small workbench, brow furrowed, goggles slightly crooked, soldering gun in hand, as she breathed life into an idea that had started as a sketch on the back of a grocery receipt. He didn't mention the woman on the road when he walked in, didn't speak of the car that gleamed like a spaceship or the look on her face when the engine fell silent, because it didn't feel like something to brag about. It felt like something you tucked into the back pocket of your day, next to the crumpled dollar bills and the quiet victories that only you needed to remember. What mattered now was the envelope resting beside Elisa's plate, the one with the $50 they had finally scraped together, held together with a paperclip and a prayer. Meanwhile, miles away in a glass-paneled office, where the walls hummed with fluorescent light and the air carried the sterile chill of decisions made quickly, Evelyn Monroe sat alone at her desk, staring not at a screen or spreadsheet but at her own hands. They were clean, polished, capable, but they didn't know what his hands had known. She had replayed the moment over and over, the way he moved, the way he listened to the car, not like a machine, but like an old friend trying to speak. Her team of engineers, talented as they were, had missed it, too buried in code and diagnostics to feel what he felt in the hum of the motor, in the pulse of the relay. And it wasn't just that he had fixed the sound. It was the way the vehicle drove now, smoother, more responsive, as if someone had removed a small stone from its shoe that had been there so long everyone had forgotten it didn't belong. She had tried to find him, called the local tow services, asked around gas stations, even scanned county business licenses, but no one seemed to know anything about a man fitting his description. The few mechanics she called hadn't heard of a Thomas Carter, or if they had, they assumed she meant someone else. The world, it seemed, still had corners untouched by the algorithms and databases her company relied on, and just when she was beginning to accept that he had chosen to remain invisible, that he had slipped back into whatever quiet life he'd come from with no interest in recognition or reward, Her assistant dropped a file on her desk, a thick manila folder labeled Southeast Youth Science Finalists, and there, clipped to the top, was a student profile with a photo attached. The girl was young, no more than 18, with skin the same rich tone as the man on the roadside, and eyes too wise for her age. Elisa Carter, it read. Hometown listed just outside the very town where her car had broken down. Her submission? Optimizing electric motor function through manual drive recalibration and analog-digital hybrid syncing. Evelyn stared at the schematic, at the drawings and handwritten annotations, and felt a jolt, not of suspicion, but of recognition. This was his work, or rather, this was the work of a father who had handed down more than advice. The day of the competition came wrapped in the early gold of spring, with banners strung across the community college entrance and folding chairs arranged in rows like polite guests. Thomas didn't want to come, said he'd wait in the truck, but Elisa insisted, tugging his sleeve with that half-smile that always reminded him of her mother. "Please, Daddy," she said, "you've earned the front row." So he sat beside teachers and donors, watching as students buzzed around with nerves and name tags, while Elisa stood by her table, composed and radiant, her model humming softly under its casing, a hybrid system that breathed like something alive. Evelyn spotted them from across the auditorium before the presentations began. She didn't rush, didn't cause a scene, simply waited until Elisa finished her quiet, confident pitch to the panel. Then she approached, eyes scanning the man who stood behind her daughter like a shadow stitched in love and grease. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice low, steady, carrying no fanfare. Thomas turned, his face surprised but not unkind. "I didn't catch your name that day," she added, "but I haven't stopped thinking about what you did." He nodded slowly, as if unsure whether to be flattered or wary. "It was just a roadside repair," he said. "Didn't seem right to leave someone stranded." "No," she replied gently. "It was more than that. You solved a problem no one else could. You saw what the data couldn't. And now I see where your daughter gets it." Thomas looked at Elisa, who stood quietly beside him, her hands clasped in front of her like she was afraid to breathe. Evelyn smiled. "I want to offer her a full scholarship," she said, "and if she's willing, a place on our summer R&D team." Elisa blinked, lips parting, stunned. Thomas gripped her shoulder gently, steadying her. Then Evelyn turned to him, eyes softer now. "And I want you to come work with us," she said. "Not because we need more resumes, but because we need more people who listen, who feel what the machines are saying." For a long moment, Thomas said nothing. Then he nodded once, slowly, as if accepting something he hadn't dared to hope for. Not a reward, not even recognition, but a door, a path, a future. And just like that, the man who had once thought the world had moved on without him stepped back into it, not with noise or acclaim, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had always belonged, just waiting for the right sound to call him forward. It was a quiet kind of triumph, the kind that doesn't announce itself with trophies or thunderous applause, but settles gently into the fabric of a life like sunlight warming old floorboards, slow and steady and full of grace. After the competition, when the last folding chair had been stacked and the final handshake exchanged, Thomas and Elisa walked back to the truck in silence, her arm tucked into his, both of them carrying more than they knew how to say. There had been no grand speeches, no dramatic music swelling in the background, just Evelyn Monroe's offer, given plainly and sincerely, and Elisa's stunned, breathless yes, spoken like a vow. The scholarship meant security, the internship meant a future. But it was something else that lingered in Thomas's chest as he turned the ignition and listened to the soft rumble of the engine beneath them. Something like relief, but deeper, older. It was the sound of a promise kept, one he'd made in whispers beside his wife's hospital bed, telling her he'd take care of their girl, telling her he'd make sure she had the wings she deserved, even if he had to build them bolt by bolt with his own hand. The weeks that followed moved like honey, slow, golden, and impossibly sweet. Evelyn kept her word with the kind of precision Thomas respected deeply. A package arrived the following Monday. Documents for the scholarship, a letter confirming Elisa's acceptance into the university's preparatory engineering cohort, and a handwritten note that simply read, "She's exactly what we need. Thank you for sharing her with the world." But that wasn't all. Beneath the paperwork was a second envelope, this one addressed to Thomas, and inside, a contract. Simple, fair, and written not in legalese, but in plain language that respected his dignity. They wanted him as a consultant, a senior mechanic for prototype development, with full access to the lab's fabrication floor and a schedule flexible enough to keep Carter's repair open if he chose. There was no catch, no clause that demanded he change who he was. They wanted him, the way he was, hands scarred and all. He didn't accept right away. That wasn't his way. He took the contract to the porch swing that creaked beneath him each evening, read it line by line, then folded it back up and stared out at the trees that swayed like old hymns across the yard. And when Elisa came out one night, her face lit by porch light and 1,000 unspoken dreams, he handed her the contract and said, "You read it too. This isn't just about me anymore." She did, carefully, then looked up and nodded, eyes bright with tears. "Mama would have said yes," she whispered. And that was all it took. Thomas started commuting 2 days a week to the Evolve Development Center, a modern building nestled on the edge of the city like a glass and steel bird waiting to take flight. He wore his work boots and denim jacket without apology, and the first time he stepped onto the floor, surrounded by engineers half his age, tapping on tablets and debating voltage curves, he felt a flicker of doubt, until one of them turned, recognized him from the internal memo Evelyn had sent, and smiled like a student meeting a teacher. Word had gotten around. They called him the Whisperer, not as a joke, but as something closer to reverence, because the first time they brought him a motor that hummed wrong, and he fixed it in 10 minutes with a wrench, a pencil, and a cup of black coffee, they realized what Evelyn had already known, that brilliance doesn't always come with a degree or a title. Sometimes it comes wrapped in calloused fingers and years of listening. Back home, Carter's repair didn't close down. It didn't need to. In fact, business picked up. Folks started bringing in cars not just because they needed fixing, but because they wanted to shake the hand of the man who had taught city engineers how to hear machines breathe. And Elisa, now glowing with the confidence of someone who knew she belonged in the room, began teaching younger kids from the community, offering weekend workshops in the shed behind the shop, explaining torque with soda cans and battery cells, her voice steady, her laughter loud, her joy radiant. Evelyn visited once, unannounced, just to sit on that porch swing and drink sweet tea with Thomas while the cicadas sang their evening hymn. "We needed you more than you needed us," she said quietly, watching the sky turn violet. And Thomas just shook his head, smiled, and replied, "No, ma'am. We all needed something. It just so happened we found it in the same place." And though life didn't become perfect, because it never truly does, it became full. Full of purpose, full of rhythm, full of mornings where Thomas and Elisa worked side by side, and evenings where they sat with their memories, not as burdens, but as lanterns, guiding them gently forward. In the quiet stillness of that small town, a father's promise had become a legacy, and a daughter's dream had become a bridge, not just for herself, but for every child who came to the shop wide-aimed and curious, believing that maybe, just maybe, they too could build something that mattered. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.